It has been terrific to be in Italy these last 4 days. My wife and Alyssa and I, this is our first time here, and we've just loved being here. As Ugo mentioned, I'm a historian. I work at the church history department. I'm not here as an official representative of the church, but as one who has studied the documents of the church's early history. Our job at the church history department is to collect documents from around the world, including the story of the church in Italy, to preserve it, and then to share it with members of the church and with other people worldwide. I spend my day reading other people's mail, old mail, and trying to glean from it the insights into the church's early history. Today I'll be talking about the first vision. You know the story of the first vision, how God the Father and Jesus Christ in 1820 visited the boy Joseph Smith. It was through the first vision that Joseph began that process by which he became a prophet and restored God's church to the earth. We primarily know the account of the first vision as it was told in a history written in 1838. 18 years after the first vision, and published in Joseph Smith History, now found in the Pearl of Great Price. Sometimes Latter-day Saints are surprised when they learn that there are other accounts of the first vision. In fact, Joseph left 4 accounts of the first vision that I'll talk to you about today. In addition, there are 5 other accounts that were written by close associates of Joseph Smith that enrich our understanding. Of course, the existence of different accounts means that there are differences between the accounts. That should not be surprising. But sometimes critics have used these differences to suggest that Joseph was being deceitful in his telling of the experience. But in reality, we should celebrate the existence of the multiple accounts, since having them enriches our understanding rather than threatens it. In my talk today, I'll be drawing upon the different accounts and an essay on the accounts that was published recently by the church on lds.org as part of a series of essays on challenging historical or doctrinal topics. These essays are found on the Gospel Topics section of lds.org. There's 11 of them. They've been published in English over the last year or two, and they were published in Italian in January of this year. While negative information about the church has always existed, there were articles attacking Joseph Smith before the church was organized. Church leaders understand that we live in an age, a digital age, in which information is increasingly accessible. Information about the church's past is often presented in the most negative light on the internet, and often deliberately distorted or even fabricated. So that is why the church has made this effort to publish this series of essays. They're not a paragraph or two long, they're lengthy essays to give church members the foundation that they need to understand these topics. If you have a question about plural marriage, about the accounts of the first vision, about the translation of the Book of Mormon, about the Book of Abraham, this is the first place to start. Read the essays. The essays were written and then reviewed by members of the first quorum of the 70, by the entire quorum of the 12 apostles, and by the first presidency of the church. the church made every effort to ensure that they are historically accurate and doctrinally sound. They are honest, they are transparent, and they are faithful. They're already being integrated into the church's curriculum so that seminary students and institute students can understand these topics. So now let's talk about the first vision. The Gospel Topics essay on the first vision makes the point that differences between accounts left by a historical figure about a particular event are exactly what you would expect to find. Uniformity would be suspicious. Historians expect that when an individual leaves several accounts, retells an experience in different settings to different audiences, some public, some private, over many years, will inevitably contain differences in perspective and differences in detail. In fact, if we look to the scriptures, think about Paul's vision on the road to Damascus, told multiple times, with differences in detail and perspective. The apostles' experience on the Mount of Transfiguration, told different times in the scriptures with different details and emphasis. On a personal level, you might think about the differences in this way. Imagine that you told the story of meeting your spouse in the following settings. First, a journal entry that you wrote on the day that you met your spouse. You didn't yet realize that this person would become your spouse. Second, a video recording of you telling the story at your wedding reception. Third, a letter written to your 8-year-old daughter talking about how you and your spouse met. Fourth, a statement that you read to your family and friends at your 50th wedding anniversary. There would be differences in emphasis, in perspective, and details. That is simply the way that human memory and human history works. In addition, variations between accounts of any historical event exist because records are imperfect. Joseph Smith understood the limitations of language in capturing the experience of the sacred. How do you capture your most inner spiritual feelings in language? He wrote to a friend, "O God, deliver us in thy due time from this little narrow prison," the prison of language. He said it was almost a total darkness of paper, pen, and ink. And he called language crooked, broken, and scattered. But of course, that's all we have. The crooked, broken, and scattered language when we express our spiritual experiences. Joseph didn't write about the first vision until 1832, 12 years after it happened. For those of you who have been on missions, think about when you would tell the story of the first vision to the people you were teaching. Generally, this happens very early in the process of teaching. In fact, you probably told the story of the first vision hundreds of times. You memorized the experience. I served in Brazil. It's been a few years, but still I can remember the language. Eu vi uma coluna de luz. I saw the pillar of light, right? That language that we would use. In the early years, missionaries didn't start with the first vision. They would often start with the visits of the angel Moroni, the visits that resulted in the gold plates and the Book of Mormon. Why might that have been? What happened when Joseph first told the story of the first vision? Do you remember the account? He goes to the minister, and what is the reaction? Such things cannot be. He's immediately told that his experience was impossible. It's waved away. Perhaps Joseph felt reluctant because of that experience. Or perhaps he simply found the experience too sacred to share too widely. Or perhaps Joseph knew, as confirmed in the reaction of that minister, that the experience was too radical, too revolutionary for most people at that day. The churches of that day taught that God was a God without body, without parts, without passions. And yet Joseph saw two personages. He saw a God with body, with parts and passions. So today I'm going to talk to you about the four accounts that he left. The first account, 1832, 12 years after the vision. This is a particularly exciting account because Joseph wrote it with his own pen, at least part of it. I work with the Joseph Smith papers. Our job is to find everything that Joseph wrote that was sent to him that he asked scribes to write. When we're done, we will publish 25 books, an average length of 600 pages. It's a lot of stuff. And yet, Joseph wrote very little of it with his own hand. He wasn't comfortable in writing. He had little education. He didn't spell well. I know, I've read his writing. But in 1832, he sat down with one of his counselors in the first presidency, Frederick G. Williams, to tell the story of his life. It is a deeply personal account. Joseph says that at about the age of 12, my mind became seriously impressed with regard to the all-important concerns for the welfare of my immortal soul, which led to my searching the scriptures, believing, as I was taught, that they contained the words of God, and thus applying myself to them. Think about yourself when you were 12. Joseph is, I think, somewhat unusual in how spiritually attuned that he was. He says that from the ages of 12 to 15, he continued this study of the scriptures. And he felt grief because of his personal sins and the wickedness of the world. He contrasted the wickedness of the world with the beauties of nature. He talks about the sun, the moon, the earth, the fields, the animals, and how they demonstrated that there was a God. And then he says, I cried unto the Lord for mercy, for there was none else to whom I could go and obtain mercy. And the Lord heard my cry in the wilderness. And while in the attitude of calling upon the Lord, in the 16th year of my age, a pillar of light above the brightness of the sun at noonday came down from above and rested upon me. I was filled with the Spirit of God, and the Lord opened the heavens upon me, and I saw the Lord. And he spake unto me, saying, Joseph, my son, thy sins are forgiven thee. Go thy way, walk in my statutes, and keep my commandments. You may have noticed some interesting details. Joseph describes the Lord who opened the heavens, and then the Lord spoke to him. I'll talk about that in a little bit. He says he was in his 16th year, or 15 years old. I'll talk about that in a bit too. But note the main emphasis. What did he record that Christ told to him? Thy sins are forgiven thee. Joseph went to the grove with a personal question. What is my standing before God? And he left with a personal answer. He was also told that the people of the world draw near to me with their lips, while their hearts are far from me. And Jesus promised that he would soon return to the earth in his glory. Following the experience, Joseph wrote, my soul was filled with love, and for many days I could rejoice with great joy. The Lord was with me, but I could find none that would believe the heavenly vision. Nevertheless, I pondered these things in my heart. This earliest account is the most personal, the most focused on Joseph's salvation, which was the question that brought him to the grove in the first place. The next account, 3 years later, Joseph is now in Kirtland. He was visited by a man named Robert Matthews, who was an eccentric religious figure. And Joseph shared the experience with him. And then Joseph's scribe wrote an account of that meeting in Joseph's journal. Joseph didn't keep his own journal. His scribe kept his journal for him. Joseph again recounted that he was confused by the different churches. I knew not who was right or who was wrong. And considering it of the first importance that I should be right in matters that involve eternal consequences, I retired to the silent grove and bowed down before the Lord. In this account, Joseph states that he was given confidence by a certain scripture. We know it, James 1 and 5. In this account, Joseph also included what happened as he attempted to pray in the grove. My tongue seemed to be swollen in my mouth, so that I could not utter. I heard a noise behind me, like some person walking towards me. I strove again to pray, but could not. The noise of walking seemed to draw closer. I sprang up on my feet and looked around, but saw no person or thing that was calculated to produce the noise of walking. But Joseph kneeled again and called on the Lord in mighty prayer. A pillar of fire appeared above my head. It rested down upon me and filled me with joy unspeakable. A personage appeared in the midst of this pillar of flame, which was spread all around, and yet nothing consumed. Another personage soon appeared, like unto the first. He said unto me, Thy sins are forgiven thee. He testified unto me that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. And I saw many angels in this vision. I was about 14 years old when I received this communication. So what do we learn from this account? The power of James 1 and 5. The opposition Joseph felt when he knelt to pray. And some details about how he experienced that opposition. Hearing a noise as if someone was walking towards him. You can feel the fear he felt. The description of the pillar of light like fire that looked as if it should be burning the trees but was not. And also the detail that Joseph saw not only the two, but many angels. Three years later, Joseph wrote another account. This is the account that you know. In 1838, Joseph started a history of the church. It eventually filled 6 big volumes of manuscript writing. It would not be finished until long after Joseph had died. But Joseph began it with the story of his life and the story of his vision. He dictated the account to a scribe who wrote it down. It was published 4 years later in the church's newspaper. Whereas the 1832 account focused on Joseph's personal forgiveness, this account was designed to tell the story of the church and the church's establishment. The central question is, which church is right? And the central answer is that none of them are, but that Joseph had a mission to perform. This is the longest of the first vision accounts. I won't read from it because you've already read it. 4 years later, another account. What is different about this one? It's published. It's printed. It was meant to be published. In 1842, Joseph responded to a newspaper editor, John Wentworth, who had asked him for a statement about the history and the beliefs of the church. An account was written by Joseph and his scribes that contains a history of the first vision, as well as 13 statements of church belief. You know them, the Articles of Faith. This account again emphasizes Joseph's confusion. It's very similar in many ways to the 1838 account in the Pearl of Great Price, but shorter. Joseph again recounted the importance of James 1 and 5 in his decision to go to a secret place in a grove to pray. Joseph believed that God could not be the author of so much confusion, that God would not teach one society to worship in one way and a different church in another way. In this account, he added that the personages who appeared exactly resembled each other in features and likeness. The message they shared was this: they told me that all religious denominations were believing in incorrect doctrines, and that none of them was acknowledged by God as his church and kingdom. And I was commanded to go not after them, and received a promise that the fullness of the gospel should at some future time be made known unto me. So those are the 4 accounts. Last month, the 4 accounts were published for the first time in translation, in Italian, in German, in French, in Spanish, in Portuguese. So if you go to the Joseph Smith Papers website, and we'll make sure there's a link on the FAIR website, and then there will be links, you can read these accounts. The 1832 account, the 1835 account, and the 1842 account. And if you want to, of course, you can read them in English on that same site. And the English version, you can look at the pictures of those accounts as they were originally written. For the Italian version, we went ahead and corrected the spelling and put in periods and commas where it should be, just to make it a little bit easier. Otherwise, it's completely as it appears in the original text. My invitation to you would be to spend an hour with these accounts. It will be an experience that affirms your faith and enriches your understanding of the prophet Joseph Smith. Now that I've given you an overview of the accounts, I want to address 2 common criticisms that people make about the first vision account. And I have to say at the beginning that I have never quite been able to understand why some people think that having multiple accounts is a problem. It's a good thing. We should celebrate it. The first criticism made is that Joseph was wrong in saying that there was what we call revivalism in Palmyra in 1820. Religious revivalism at the time was a common phenomenon at which preachers would travel the countryside, have camp meetings, as you see in this picture, and try to convert people, try to help them to be saved. As you can see in this picture, and this picture, revivalism was not quite like our sacrament meetings. It was a little bit more lively. You got up, you shouted. The preacher was very animated. People would swoon, and they were very animated events. Since the 1960s, some people have argued that there was no revival in Palmyra in 1820. But there is every reason to believe that there was revivalism in Joseph's area and at that time that confused and distressed young Joseph Smith exactly as he stated. The context is well established. The region in which Joseph Smith lived in New York was known as the burned over district, meaning that it had been burned over by the fires of revivalism. Camp meetings were a common phenomenon. Lucy Mack Smith even talks about how the Smith family, being poor, sold goods sometimes at camp meetings. They would take baked goods and sell them. And we know that there was camp meetings within a day's journey of the Smith's house. In June 1818, a camp meeting just outside of Palmyra led to 20 baptisms and 40 new converts. The next year, there were camp meetings about 15 miles south of the Smith farm. One Methodist who participated in these revivals remembered that there was a religious cyclone that swept the area. One Methodist minister was present at these revivals who was particularly important, a man by the name of George Lane. He was present at revival meetings in 1819 and 1820 near the Smiths' home. And Oliver Cowdery and William Smith, Joseph's brother, said that George Lane influenced Joseph. The message of George Lane's preaching was that you had to have a conversion experience, that you had to feel that you had been saved. And he used a particular scripture to teach people how they might be saved. James 1 and 5. So it appears that Joseph heard George Lane's preaching, took the scripture to heart, read it again, and was inspired by it. So just to emphasize that the historical record is clear, that there were revivals in Joseph Smith's day and time. The second major criticism of the first vision uses the differences between the accounts to suggest that Joseph Smith changed his story. That he told one story in 1832, then another story in 1838, and a different story in 1842. You may have noticed two discrepancies between the accounts that I said I would talk more about. One, we're used to the Pearl of Great Price account telling us that Joseph was 14 years old. But in the first account, he said he was in his 16th year, meaning that he was 15. That seems strange. Joseph should know how old he had been. But let's look at this just a little bit closer. Here we have the account of the first vision. You can see between the top line and the second to top line in the account, there's writing that's been inserted between the lines. Now, what that writing says that was inserted between the lines, meaning that it was written later, it says, in the 16th year of my age. Meaning that Joseph and Frederick G. Williams didn't even put his age initially in the account. And Frederick G. Williams added it at some point. Now, maybe Joseph told him to add it, we just don't know. But it's interesting that the discrepancy is an addition that is later. So perhaps Frederick G. Williams added it and didn't know Joseph's age. But it's also possible that Joseph himself was a little confused about his age. That seems strange. We always know how old we are, right? But in Joseph's day, birthdays weren't a big deal. They didn't have birthday parties. It wasn't culturally important. Let me give you an example. In 1835, the Quorum of the 12 Apostles is organized. Seniority within the Quorum of the 12 is important. How do you organize the quorum according to seniority when they're all called at the same time? Age. The oldest man is the president of the quorum. So the quorum president was Thomas B. Marsh. The only problem with that is that we now know from original birth records that David W. Patton was older than Thomas B. Marsh and apparently didn't know his exact age to say, actually, Thomas, I'm the oldest man here. Knowledge of exact ages and birth dates just wasn't that culturally important. But critics are even more likely to talk about another apparent discrepancy in the accounts. This slide actually shows you the insertion in the 16th year of my age a little bit closer. You can see the small mark where the insertion was to go in the account. In 1832, Joseph wrote, "And the Lord opened the heavens upon me, and I saw the Lord." In 1835, Joseph said, "A personage appeared in the midst of this pillar of flame, which was spread all around, and yet nothing consumed. Another personage soon appeared, like unto the first." So it's clear in that account that one appeared, some time passed, and then another appeared. In 1838, when the light rested upon me, I saw two personages. And then in 1842, I was enwrapped in a heavenly vision, and I saw two glorious personages. So 3 of the 4 accounts clearly state that two personages appeared. The outlier is Joseph Smith's 1832 account, which can be read to refer to either one or two personages. If read to refer to one heavenly being, it would likely refer to the personage who forgave his sins. According to later accounts, the first divine personage told Joseph Smith to hear the second, Jesus Christ, who then delivered the main message, which included the message of forgiveness. The earliest account, the most personal account, may have focused on Jesus Christ, the bearer of forgiveness. So it's possible that Joseph was just referring to Jesus in that account. Another way of reading the 1832 account is that Joseph referred to two beings, both of whom he called Lord. Note that the two references to Lord are separated in time. First, the Lord opens the heavens, then Joseph Smith sees the Lord. This reading is consistent with the 1835 account, which has one appearing and then another. But either way, so there's a few different ways to think about it. Perhaps he was just referring to Jesus in that first account, and perhaps he was referring to both God and Jesus. In part, the differences between the 1832 account and the later accounts may have had something to do with the differences between the spoken and the written word. It was in 1832 that Joseph Smith talked about the prison of language. He was not comfortable in writing. The other accounts were all dictated accounts. Joseph Smith was comfortable in speaking and preaching and dictating. It was a medium that worked well for him. So what happens if we listen closely to Joseph's accounts? What would an enriched account of the first vision sound like? I want to read to you an account that puts them all together. Joseph said that he matured under the care of godly parents who spared no pains to teach him about Christianity. At about the age of 12, his mind became focused on the questions of his immortal soul. The revivals in the area put the question, "What must I do to be saved?" foremost in his mind. Joseph explained, "I knew not who was right or who was wrong." He was exceedingly distressed because he felt convicted of his sins. And by searching the scriptures, he saw differences between the churches of his day and the Bible, what the Bible taught. During a time of religious excitement, his concerns about his soul became a personal crisis. He wondered whether the churches were all wrong together. He experienced confusion, extreme difficulties, and great uneasiness caused by his sense of guilt for sins. In addition, the religious battles of the day were a grief to his soul. He saw how the Bible was used as a weapon, how the different churches used the Bible against each other, and he felt pained because of that. He went to the Bible himself, privately, quietly, and it spoke to his soul. He said he was laboring under extreme difficulties when he read James 1 and 5. "If any of you lack wisdom, let him ask of God, that giveth to all men liberally and upbraideth not, and it shall be given." This passage made a permanent impression. Joseph said, "I reflected on it again and again, knowing that if any person needed wisdom from God, I did." On a clear spring morning in 1820, he left his home to seek seclusion in a familiar setting. This is the sacred grove as it would have appeared in early spring. He sought solitude in the woods because he had determined to pray. He said it was the first time he prayed vocally in his life. But it was a place he'd been many times. He said it was near the stump where I had stuck my axe when I had quit work. He knelt on the ground, and as he proceeded to open his mouth, he was overcome by an unseen power. Surrounded by thick darkness, he felt doomed. He said the adversary filled his mind with doubts and brought to mind all manner of inappropriate things. He learned quickly of the power of the enemy which had seized upon him. It had astonishing power. But he exerted his powers to call upon God to deliver me from the power of that enemy. And just at that moment, Joseph became conscious of a brilliant heavenly light, brighter than the sun, descending upon him from the tops of the trees. The nearer the light came, the more brilliant it was, until it seemed like the leaves and the boughs of the trees should be consumed by fire. The light rested on the earth, and Joseph was surrounded by it, just as he had been surrounded by the darkness. In the midst of that light, Joseph saw a glorious personage standing in the air. He said that the personage had a white tunic drawn over his shoulders, and his right arm was bare. Soon after, another personage appeared who resembled the other. Calling Joseph by name, the first pointed to the second and said, "This is my beloved son. Hear him." They had two messages. A message of personal forgiveness. And then Joseph asked, which church was right? I was answered, I must join none of them, for they were all wrong. None of the churches were acknowledged of God as his church and kingdom. The everlasting covenant was broken. The creeds, the doctrinal statements that governed the churches, was singled out for criticism. The creeds were called an abomination in the sight of God. And the experience in the grove undermined the creeds. The creed said that God was unknowable, incomprehensible. Yet here he was. The creed said that God was without body, parts or passions. Yet Joseph saw and heard the personages and felt their love. For many days after the experience, his soul was filled with love, and he rejoiced. He had found what he had most desired. He had gone to the sacred grove, the silent grove, and found that the testimony of James was true, that a man who lacked wisdom might ask of God and obtain. The answer to his prayerful quest was not the experience that the revival preachers had encouraged or that Joseph expected. There was no shouts of rejoicing. Remember those pictures of the revival. No deep tones of the preacher, no one preaching to him. There was just Joseph in the wilderness, acting on the Bible's invitation to ask and receive. It's been a privilege to share these thoughts on the first vision with you. As I said earlier, we should be grateful that there are several accounts. The differences between them are exactly what a historian would expect when dealing with different accounts given in different settings for different purposes over many different years. On a personal note, I will say that I've worked at the Joseph Smith Papers at the Church History Department for about 4.5 years now. I've spent hundreds and hundreds of hours reading Joseph's mail and his journals and his histories and his other documents. Some people appear worse the better you know them, either historically or in a contemporary setting. Joseph Smith does not. He appears better, more thoughtful, more compassionate. To see him in his struggles and in his triumphs has been something that has increased my respect for him as a man and deepened my faith in him as a prophet. It is my testimony that Joseph was being truthful when he said, I had seen a vision. I knew it, and I knew that God knew it, and I could not deny it. I am grateful that Joseph had the courage to do what God wanted him to do. He was opposed consistently and at times violently in his life for refusing to deny what he knew he had seen, and he has been slandered ever since. And I pray that we have similar courage in our lives to go to our own groves and to seek to understand God's will for us, and then to go forward in faith. And I leave that testimony in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.